My name is Isla Bennett, and for most of my life, people saw me as fragile, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. They called me broken, whispered that I'd never recover from the things that happened to me. But they were wrong. I learned that strength isn't loud, it's silent, steady, and born in the dark. Every time I was knocked down, I rose sharper, calmer, and more certain of who I was. They called me broken, but they'll never understand how beautiful it feels to finally be whole.
Writing. I still remember the morning when my world collapsed. The sunlight came through the curtains like it always did, but everything felt strangely heavy, like the air itself was warning me that something was about to change forever. I was 19, full of dreams, and foolish enough to believe that love and family were unshakable. That morning, I walked downstairs expecting warmth, but instead, I found a silence so cold it made my skin tighten. My parents sat at the table, my father with his coffee, my mother staring blankly into her hands. The tension in the room felt like a wall I couldn't break through. When my father finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, his voice controlled but merciless. He told me I was a disappointment, that I'd failed them, failed myself, failed everyone who had believed in me. I tried to laugh it off at first, thinking maybe he was just angry, that maybe there was still love behind his words. But when my mother wouldn't meet my eyes, when she turned her face away as if ashamed to even look at me, I knew this wasn't anger, it was rejection. Every dream I had ever shared with them flashed through my mind, all those nights when I had imagined them cheering for me, proud of me. Instead, my father's words echoed through the room like a verdict. You're broken, Isla. You'll never make it. I packed my things quietly that afternoon. A few clothes, a notebook, some cash I had saved from my part-time job. As I stepped out of that house, I didn't look back. The door closed behind me with a sound I'll never forget. Final, like a chapter slamming shut. The streets felt too big, the sky too wide. Every step I took away from home carried the weight of their words. I found temporary shelter at a friend's tiny apartment. It was small, damp, and barely had space for two, but it was the first place I started to feel something close to freedom. Still, the silence at night was unbearable. I'd lie awake carrying my father's voice in my head, telling me I was nothing. I cried quietly, afraid of waking anyone, my tears soaking the pages of the journal where I started to write down everything I felt, every fear, every hope, every spark of anger that still lived in me. And one night, after hours of staring at the ceiling, something inside me shifted. A voice I hadn't heard in years whispered, "You don't have to stay broken." That moment didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the pain or the loneliness, but it gave me a direction, a reason to rise. I didn't know how or when, but I made a silent vow to myself that night. I would build something from the pieces they left behind. I would show them that the girl they called broken could become something whole, something powerful. That was the night I stopped being a victim of their words and began becoming the author of my own story. The days that followed were a blur of struggle and self-discovery. I had no money, no family to turn to, and no idea where my life was heading. Every morning, I'd walk the city streets with my resume in hand, applying for jobs I was either underqualified or overqualified for. Most doors closed before I could even step inside. But every rejection hardened me, shaping me into someone who refused to surrender. I began to see survival not as desperation, but as an act of defiance. I worked odd jobs, waiting tables, cleaning offices, handing out flyers in the cold. It wasn't glamorous, but each paycheck felt like proof that I was still standing. Sometimes I'd pass by families laughing together in cafes, and a quiet ache would settle in my chest. But instead of breaking me, it fueled me. I started saving every bit I could, spending my nights reading about business, psychology, and self-growth. I was building myself from scratch. No safety net, no guidance, just stubborn willpower. There were nights when exhaustion would hit so hard that I'd break down, wondering if it was worth it. But then I'd remember that day in the kitchen, my father's voice calling me useless. And like a spark reigniting a fire, I'd rise again. I started keeping a small notebook filled with affirmations. Simple words like, I am enough and I'm not broken anymore. Those words became my armor against the world's indifference. One day while working late at a cafe, I overheard two women talking about a local business seminar. Something about their conversation stirred me. I didn't have the money for the ticket, but I went anyway, slipping into the back of the crowded room. Listening to people talk about building dreams, taking risks, and turning pain into purpose, it lit something inside of me. For the first time in months, I felt alive. I realized that success wasn't just for people born with privilege, it was for anyone brave enough to rebuild after being broken. That night, I walked home under the city lights, a strange sense of peace washing over me. I didn't have much, but I had direction. I whispered to myself, this is just the beginning. And deep down, I knew it was. Months passed, and life began to find a fragile rhythm. I was no longer just surviving. I was learning how to live again, even if it meant starting from nothing. The seminar I had sneaked into kept replaying in my mind. The way those speakers talked about turning failures into foundations. It awakened something fierce in me. I started to imagine my own company, one built on the very values I had been denied: resilience, compassion, and second chances. I didn't know exactly what it would be, but I knew what it would stand for. It would be proof that pain could be transformed into purpose. Every evening after work, I'd sit by the window of my tiny apartment, scribbling plans in a notebook that had once been filled with tears and affirmations. Now it held blueprints of a dream. I researched late into the night: business models, marketing strategies, funding sources. My laptop was old, the Wi-Fi barely worked, and my bank account was laughably empty. But I didn't stop. I told myself that if I could survive rejection from my own blood, then rejection from strangers wouldn't scare me. I started small. I began offering freelance design work online, taking projects that paid barely enough to buy a meal, but I treated each one as if it were worth $1 million. Slowly, people started noticing my dedication. My clients were impressed not by fancy degrees, but by the care and precision I poured into everything I created. It wasn't just about work. It was about rebuilding my confidence one task at a time. Then came the turning point. One client, a small local brand, asked me to design their entire visual identity. It was more than I had ever done, but I said yes without hesitation. For days, I poured my soul into it, working through the night, fueled by coffee and conviction. When the campaign launched, it went viral. People started asking who was behind it, and for the first time, my name meant something more than a memory of failure. That success became my first real step toward independence. It was still far from my dream company, but it was a beginning, a flicker of what could become a fire. I could feel the pieces of my broken self fitting back together, not as they once were, but as something stronger, something new. One night, as I stared at the city lights outside my window, I whispered, they called me broken, but maybe I was just unfinished. That thought stayed with me, and from that moment on, I stopped running from my past. Instead, I started building the future I deserved, one that would soon silence every voice that had ever doubted me. The first spark of success was intoxicating, but it also brought fear. For the first time, I had something to lose. The world that once ignored me was now watching, and I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against my shoulders. I was still living paycheck to paycheck, still fighting self-doubt every night. But one thing had changed forever. I had purpose. The small freelance projects grew into consistent work, and my client list slowly expanded through word of mouth. Still, deep down, I knew I wasn't meant to just work for others. I was meant to build something of my own. I remember the night I decided to do it. I sat in my dimly lit room, surrounded by notes, sketches, and coffee cups, when I finally whispered the words out loud. I'm starting my own company. It sounded ridiculous at first. Me, the girl who had been called useless, daring to dream of owning a business. But that's what made it beautiful. I had no investors, no family support, no one cheering me on. What I had was grit, sleepless nights, and an unshakable need to prove that brokenness can be reborn into brilliance. The first months were chaos. I worked from my kitchen table, juggling calls, designs, and invoices all at once. I'd wake up before sunrise, take on side gigs during the day, and return to my laptop at night to build my brand. There were days I wanted to give up, when the power would go out mid-project or when I couldn't afford proper software. But each obstacle reminded me of how far I had come from that terrified 19-year-old girl standing in her parents' doorway. One of my biggest lessons came through failure. I landed a large project for a corporate client, my first real breakthrough, and I poured everything into it. But when their campaign didn't meet expectations, they blamed me. They refused to pay, and suddenly months of effort vanished into nothing. I cried for hours, convinced I had made a mistake chasing this dream. But the next morning, I did something different. I didn't quit. I wrote down every mistake, every oversight, every lesson that experience had taught me, and that notebook became my silent mentor. Slowly, I rebuilt my business plan, smarter, cleaner, and stronger. I registered my company name officially, Wholeness Creative Studio. It wasn't just a business, it was a declaration, a promise that what others destroy, I can rebuild, that what they call broken, I can make beautiful. By the end of that first year, I had 3 regular clients, a growing portfolio, and a fire inside me that couldn't be dimmed. I still lived humbly, still worked long hours, but every small success stitched another piece of me back together. I no longer chased validation, I chased excellence. And when I looked in the mirror one night, tired, messy, but smiling, I realized something powerful. I was no longer trying to prove my parents wrong. I was proving myself right. What they once called broken was now becoming something unstoppable, something whole. The day I walked back into my parents' world was nothing like I'd imagined it would be. I wasn't there to beg for forgiveness or to show off my success. I was there because I had finally made peace with the past. 3 years had passed since the day I left their house with trembling hands and tear-stained cheeks. Now, I stood in front of their company building, not as their daughter, but as a partner from Wholeness Creative Studio, the firm they had just hired for a complete rebranding campaign. When I stepped into the lobby, my heart pounded, but not from fear, from control. I was wearing a suit that I'd bought with my own hard-earned money, carrying a tablet filled with designs my team and I had crafted. The receptionist smiled at me, unaware of the storm of history beneath my calm expression. I was led into the meeting room, and as the door opened, I saw them, my parents, sitting at the head of the table. My mother's eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering behind her composure. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. I introduced myself with confidence, as if we were strangers meeting for the first time. "Good morning," I said evenly. "I'm Isla Bennett, founder and creative director of Wholeness Creative Studio. Thank you for choosing us for this collaboration." The silence that followed was thick. I could see the questions forming in their eyes. How? When? But I didn't give them the satisfaction of answers. I spoke about strategy, branding, and market presence, every word measured, professional, and powerful. The same voice that once trembled in their kitchen now commanded the room. When the meeting ended,
My mother lingered. She looked at me, searching for the daughter she once dismissed. Isla, she whispered, you've changed. I smiled softly. No, I replied, I just stopped believing I was broken. Her eyes filled with something that looked like regret, but I didn't need it anymore. I had already forgiven her long before this day, not for her sake, but for mine. Later, as I stepped out of the building into the sunlight, the city felt different, alive, familiar, almost welcoming. I realized that I hadn't come back to prove them wrong. I had come back to close a chapter. They had once thrown me out, convinced I would fall apart. Instead, I built an empire from my ruins and returned not as the fragile girl they remembered, but as a woman who had learned how to rise. That night, I sat by my window the same way I had on the night I made my first vow to rebuild myself. Only this time, I wasn't lost or scared. I was grateful. I whispered into the quiet, they called me broken, but they'll remember me as whole. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the moment I finally stood tall enough to look back and smile, not with bitterness, but with peace. Success didn't come overnight. It came with blisters, sleepless nights, and lessons carved into every scar I carried. But as the months turned into years, Wholeness Creative Studio began to flourish in ways I had only dreamed of. My small apartment was replaced by a real office, sunlit, filled with laughter, and walls covered in designs that told stories of resilience. I hired people who, like me, had once been told they weren't good enough. Single mothers, college dropouts, survivors of burnout and rejection. I didn't just want a company, I wanted a sanctuary for dreamers who had been told to stop dreaming. Each project we took on became personal, a chance to prove that beauty could be born from pain. Clients began trusting us not just for our work, but for our authenticity. We weren't just designing brands, we were rebuilding identities, restoring hope, crafting meaning out of messes. I watched my team grow, their confidence blooming alongside mine. For the first time in my life, I felt proud, not because of the money or recognition, but because I was finally living in alignment with the woman I had always wanted to be. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a youth conference about resilience and entrepreneurship. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of young faces filled with hope and fear, I saw my younger self in them. My voice trembled at first, but then steadied as I spoke. They'll call you broken when they don't understand your journey. But remember, sometimes being broken is just the first step toward being rebuilt into something stronger. The applause that followed wasn't just for the words. It was for every invisible battle I had fought to stand there. After that, everything shifted again. Media outlets began reaching out, and my story spread beyond the studio. I was invited to panels, interviews, podcasts, each time sharing not just my success, but the truth behind it. I didn't hide the pain anymore. I used it as proof that healing was possible. People began writing to me, saying my journey gave them courage. And every time I read those messages, I felt something inside me heal a little more. Then, one evening while leaving the office, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Poised, calm, confident. The woman staring back at me was not the girl who once cried herself to sleep. She was whole. Not flawless, not untouched, but whole in a way that only someone who has faced her own ruins could be. I walked to my desk, picked up my old, torn notebook, the same one filled with pain, plans, and promises, and ran my hand over its cover. It was a reminder of how far I had come. I whispered softly, "You made it." And for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to myself. They called me broken, but they were wrong. I was never broken.
I was just becoming. Years later, I found myself standing in the middle of my company's new headquarters, a glass-walled building filled with warmth, color, and creativity. The sound of laughter echoed from every corner, the kind of laughter that came from people who loved what they did. The office smelled like fresh coffee and hope. As I walked through the halls, watching my team brainstorm ideas and celebrate milestones, I realized that this very moment, was everything I had ever dreamed of when I had nothing. My journey had come full circle. From a girl who was told she was broken to a woman whose name was now associated with healing, growth, and creation. I had built something far greater than a business. I had built a legacy. Every person I hired carried a story like mine, stories of rejection, struggle, and rebuilding. And together, we created something that went beyond design. We created change. I started a foundation under the same name, the Wholeness Project, dedicated to supporting young women who had been told they weren't enough. We offered mentorships, grants, and workshops to help them find their footing. Each time I spoke at those gatherings, I would see tears, smiles, and sparks of courage flicker in the crowd. I often told them, "You don't need to be perfect to begin, you just need to begin." And they listened because they knew I spoke from a place of truth, not theory. Then one day, a letter arrived. It was from my mother. I hadn't heard from her in years. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly smudged as if the words had been rewritten a dozen times before being sent. She wrote, "We were wrong. I was wrong. I see you now, Isla, not as broken, but as brave. I hope one day you'll forgive us." I read the letter in silence, tears blurring the words. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. I didn't need revenge or validation. I had outgrown the weight of their judgment. Forgiveness wasn't something I gave them, it was something I gave myself. Months later, when I finally visited them, my father's health had weakened, his voice softer than I remembered. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. He looked at me with pride in his eyes and said, "You did it." And for the first time, I smiled not to hide hurt, but to share peace. That night, as I stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker, I thought of all the versions of me that had carried me here: the scared girl, the fighter, the dreamer, the builder. They all existed within me still, each one a part of my wholeness. I took a deep breath and whispered to the wind, "I'm not broken. I never was. I was just finding the light." And as the city glowed beneath me, I realized that wholeness isn't about being unscarred. It's about wearing your scars as proof that you healed. That was my story. That was my victory. And now it belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were less than what they truly are. The years that followed felt like living inside a dream I had built with my own hands. Wholeness Creative Studio had become more than a company. It had become a movement. The name itself carried weight now, symbolizing a kind of healing that couldn't be taught in business schools. I traveled to cities I'd only ever seen in magazines, spoke on stages where my voice once would have trembled, and met people who told me my story gave them the courage to rebuild theirs. Each encounter reminded me that pain, when transformed, becomes purpose. But with growth came reflection. One quiet evening after a long conference, I sat alone in a hotel room overlooking the skyline. Success had filled the cracks my parents once pointed out, but I realized something deeper. Wholeness wasn't about erasing those cracks. It was about honoring them. They were the proof that I had lived,
fought, and healed. My company, my story, my life. They were all mosaics made of broken pieces that found their way back together. Soon, I began mentoring young women who reminded me of my 19-year-old self, lost, afraid, desperate to belong. I told them the truth I had learned the hard way. You don't become whole when the world accepts you. You become whole when you accept yourself. Watching them grow, find their voices, and create their own paths became the most rewarding part of my journey. It wasn't about fame or recognition anymore. It was about legacy, the kind that outlives you in the hearts of others. One afternoon, while clearing out old boxes in my office, I found that same faded notebook from the beginning, the one filled with pain and promises. The pages were wrinkled, the ink faded, but the words still held the same power. I turned to the first page where I had written, "I will rebuild myself." I smiled softly, realizing I had done exactly that, and so much more. I had built a life, a mission, in a world that celebrated resilience. Later that night, standing by the window as the city pulsed with life, I whispered a quiet thank you to every person who doubted me, every obstacle that shaped me, and every moment that nearly broke me. Because without them, I would never have discovered the strength that lived inside me all along. The camera would fade out here, soft piano in the background, city lights glowing like stars, while my voice, steady and calm, delivers the closing line. They called me broken, but maybe being broken was the only way I could learn to become whole. And as the music swells, the screen fades to black, leaving behind the echo of resilience, rebirth, and the quiet triumph of a woman who found her light. It's strange how life has a way of bringing us back to where everything began. Only this time, we stand taller, wiser, and unshakably calm. Years after founding Wholeness Creative Studio, I found myself driving back to the quiet town where my story first fell apart. The same narrow streets, the same small cafes, even the same bookstore I once hid in when I had nowhere else to go. But everything felt smaller now. Not because the town had changed, but because I had. I parked outside the old family house, the one I'd left behind with a backpack and a bruised heart. It looked older, worn by time, just like the memories it held. My parents had retired and moved out years ago. The house was now up for sale. As I stood there, watching the wind stir the curtains through the window, I felt no anger, no pain, just peace. The ghosts of my past didn't scare me anymore. They were just echoes of a chapter I had already closed. A local reporter had reached out earlier that week, asking to feature my story in a segment called Homegrown Success. Standing in front of the camera in the same town that once swallowed me whole, I spoke about resilience, not as a fairy tale ending, but as a continuous journey. Healing, I said, isn't a destination. It's a rhythm you learn to live by. Some days you rise, some days you stumble, but you keep moving. After the interview, I visited my old school. The hallways felt smaller too, but I could almost see my younger self walking there, quiet, afraid, yet filled with potential. I wanted to reach through time and tell her, "You make it. You really do." The principal, an older woman now, showed me a mural the students had painted on the wall. In big, bold letters, it read, "Broken is not the end." She smiled and said, "Your story inspired this." My throat tightened with emotion. I had become the person I needed back then, and that realization was more healing than any success I'd ever achieved. That night, I stood by the edge of town, where the fields met the horizon, and watched the sunset spill gold over everything. I whispered to the wind, "Thank you for breaking me, for remaking me, for teaching me who I am. The pain that once defined me now felt distant, like a storm that had passed long ago. As I drove away, the sign at the town's exit came into view. I smiled as I read it, the headlights catching the words, "You are now leaving your past behind." And with that, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I realized that wholeness isn't what happens after the pain ends. It's what happens when you choose to keep living despite it. I had come full circle. And this time, I was home. Not in a house, but in myself. Months after returning to my hometown, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm, one that finally made sense. My studio was thriving beyond what I'd ever dreamed, but more than that, I had built a community that truly believed in healing and creativity. Every project we took on carried the same heartbeat, transforming pain into purpose. I began mentoring young artists who, like me, once felt lost in the noise of judgment and fear. Each time I saw one of them bloom, I felt a quiet joy, a reminder that the cycle of breaking and rebuilding could create something beautiful if guided by compassion. One day, I received a letter from a girl named Amelia. She wrote, "I saw your documentary online. I thought I was broken too, but you showed me that maybe I'm not." Her words made me cry, not because they were sad, but because they mirrored exactly what I once needed to hear. For so long, I chased wholeness as if it was something outside of me, waiting to be earned or found. But standing there, reading her letter, I realized that wholeness had always lived within. It was just buried beneath doubt and hurt. I started writing again, not just for the world, but for myself. Essays, poems, reflections, all small pieces of the puzzle that made me feel grounded. Some nights I'd sit on the balcony, coffee in hand, city lights flickering below, and think about how far I'd come. The loneliness that once haunted me had softened into solitude, a kind that felt like peace, not punishment. On the anniversary of leaving home, I hosted an art exhibition titled Whole Now. Every painting, photograph, and piece of writing told a part of the journey, mine and countless others who'd learned to love their cracks. The event drew hundreds of people, but the most meaningful moment came when a woman approached me in tears. She said, "You don't know me, but your story saved my daughter." I hugged her, unable to speak, realizing that my healing had become a bridge for others. That night, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, I looked at one final piece hanging on the wall, a shattered mirror pieced back together with gold veins, a symbol of kintsugi, the Japanese art of embracing imperfection. The plaque beneath read, "They called me broken, but I am whole now." For the first time in my life, I didn't just believe those words, I embodied them. I understood that being whole wasn't about never breaking again. It was about knowing how to rebuild with grace, no matter how many times life tried to pull me apart. And in that quiet realization, I finally found what I had been searching for all along. Not perfection, not revenge, not validation, but peace. True, unshakable peace. The morning after the exhibition, I walked to the river that ran behind the studio, a place I used to visit when I felt like I had nothing left. The sun was just rising, turning the water gold, and for a moment it felt like the world was breathing with me. I stood there in silence, feeling the weight of every version of myself that had brought me here. The scared girl who once hid her tears, the defiant woman who refused to give up, and the artist who learned that pain could be transformed into light. I thought about the people who once doubted me, family, friends, even strangers. But instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude. Their disbelief had forced me to find belief within myself. Their rejection had pushed me toward people who saw me clearly. And their words, the ones that used to sting, had become echoes that no longer reached me. I had outgrown the noise. That day, I made a promise to never shrink myself again for anyone's comfort and to keep building spaces for others to heal. The studio expanded into a foundation, offering free creative therapy programs for women starting over. The laughter and light that filled those rooms felt like music, proof that even from the darkest wounds, beauty could bloom. As months passed, I found peace in simplicity. I traveled, painted, wrote, and spent time with people who didn't just admire my strength, but honored my softness. Life no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a garden I was tending, one day at a time. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I looked out my window and whispered to the universe, "Thank you." Not for the pain, but for the resilience it taught me, for showing me that being broken was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of becoming. And in that stillness, I understood. I was never broken. I was always whole, just waiting to see it for myself.